Hi everybody, my name is Carolyn. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be doing something new. So this is going to be the start of a reading vlog. So I'm just going to take you through my week and how much I read each day as someone who works a 8 to 5 job. Today is Monday, March 24th. I'm going to be talking about what I read on Sunday till now. So there is a lot to catch up on. And I'm very excited to talk about it because everything that I'm reading right now is pure gold, essentially. So I will be talking about non spoilers and then spoilers and kind of how many pages I've read and all that good stuff. So the first one, I'm currently, I think, in the middle of 4 or 5 books. And I haven't made much progress in some and made progress in the other. I just came back from work and I actually had a lot of time to read today at work. Sometimes I get a lot of time to read, sometimes I get no time to read. It really depends on who shows up, who doesn't. So today, though, I got a lot of time to read. I don't know what it is about Mondays, but people just don't show up to their appointments, which is fine because I got a lot of time to read. So the first one I wanted to talk about is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Again, this is the Penguin Classics Deluxe Edition, which I honestly really like because the cover is kind of stunning. Here's the back as well, also really stunning. I think that a lot of classic covers have sort of like vintage photographs, but I personally really like this cartoon one because it's a little bit different. So I really like it. But that's besides the point. I'm reading this for my in real life book club, and our objective this week is to read up to part 2, which I just finished today actually. If you don't know, this book is I don't really know the summary, but it's basically about this book was written in 1860s Russia, and this student, former student, he dropped out of university. He goes and kills someone, and I say it like it's no big deal. A guy who shows up, kills someone, and it's all about how he deals with the aftermath, basically, is kind of where I'm up to. And the title really fits the themes of the book, Crime and Punishment. This book is astounding, actually. Part 2 definitely goes into more plot. There's a lot more momentum because you're introduced to a lot of characters that we tried to meet with in part 1. And I can't really say much about this book without spoiling it, so I'll probably go into spoilers pretty soon here. But suffice to say that I am really, really loving this book. There is a lot to chew on in this book. There's a lot of more nihilism in this book than I initially thought. Right. It definitely spins you into this kind of existential dread almost because the main character thinks a lot about suffering and punishment, hence the title. He thinks a lot about, how come we do the things we do, so much suffering in this world. What's the point of doing good when there is just going to be someone else that's also going to suffer as soon as you help this person? And there's a lot of talk about that as to what is an appropriate punishment for a crime. Are people appropriately punished for their crimes? What is a crime? And it really kind of gives you a lot to think about in terms of those two words, right? And then there's a lot of talk about suffering as well and how we alleviate suffering and what is the right thing to do. Very, very much heavy hitter questions, but I will let you figure that out for yourself. But I'm really, really enjoying this book so far, and I can't wait to read the rest of the book. So let's move on to spoilers. So our guy Raz. I'm gonna call our guy Raz because I there is no way I'm going to get all of these Russian names right, and I feel like it's more important for me to kind of get out my thoughts out there, but hopefully I can pronounce them correctly the next time. So, yeah. So in this part, Raz is kind of reeling from what he has done, right? The murder. But the more and more he goes on, the more and more he realizes that he is getting away with quite a lot and no one is suspecting him. But that simultaneously makes him more nervous, which is interesting. We do get some interesting political commentary when Luzhin comes into the scene and they have a heated argument. Um, Luzhin reminds me, his views on things remind me a lot of, I think, what we would call today is more of a capitalistic viewpoint. But in the footnotes here, I think he was described as a radical social democrat. But it reminds me of a very simplified view of trickle down economics because he's basically saying that, when I help other people, they none of us get what we want, right? And why don't I look out for myself? And then when I look out for myself, other people will become more prosperous, which our main character takes offense to. And I think it's very, very interesting because I think I would probably classify Raz as more of a socialist so far. Um, he's kind of a bit out for himself, but um, he probably would like to think that he's a socialist. So it was very interesting to see those differing political viewpoints just in that conversation. There is a lot more talk in part two also about um, punishment, right? Because there was a scene in this part where I think he's like wandering around the streets and people think that he's drunk and he gets like whipped once, but then he turns around and he gets money from someone, which is kind of a whiplash, right? No pun intended. But it's just very interesting how a lot of these moral boundaries just don't matter anymore, right? Because he's getting whipped and then he's getting rewarded for just existing, right? And that juxtaposition I think is very, very interesting. So I'm interested to see how that's explored more. And then of course, Marmalov dies at the end after being trampled by a horse. It's hard not to see the parallels between Raz's dreams, where the horse kind of gets punished and is suffering, but the horse here is trampling Marmalov. I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more, but I thought that was very interesting. I also really liked all the biblical imagery during the scene when Marmalov dies. First of all, there is that scene where Sonia, right? There is a footnote with Sonia where she is supposed to represent kind of like this angel imagery. And I thought it was just very interesting because Marmalov is scared when he sees her. And I think there can be two sort of comparisons to this, right? One is that, you know, Marmalov has to kind of face what Sonia has had to do to kind of keep him and his family alive and he is drinking all their money, right? So he's kind of afraid to face the truth of what he's done. But I think he's also afraid to face that light and face the the goodness, I guess, because of what he's done in his life. Um, and also, I think Katerina had quite poignant things to say as well. Katerina is, of course, Marmalov's wife. Katerina, the priest tells her, you should forgive him. He's dead. We shouldn't think about the dead poorly. But she says, and I think I kind of agree with her on this, that haven't I forgiven him enough? I've cared for him. I've done everything that to keep him alive. You know, she it seems to be when she's cleaning him up that she's done this quite a bit when he was drunk. And it's kind of a relief to her that he died. And she doesn't feel guilty about feeling like relieved that he died, which is totally understandable from her point of view, right? She has totally given up on the fact that he will get better and that he will try and protect the family and do good by them. Um, so it's just, I think that's just very interesting. And in all of this, Raz is trying to help him as well. So I don't think he can never really stop, like look away from the suffering, right? Which I also think is quite interesting as well. I think those were the main things that I found I really liked in this book. In part two so far. This book is a lot more existential than I thought it was, and it definitely goes that far, right? Things, the moral boundaries are starting to crumble a lot. So I'm interested to see where part three goes. He's getting really, really cocky, and I cannot believe the things that he says just in broad daylight. It's as if he thinks no one's gonna catch him, right? Which he doesn't probably think no one's gonna catch him at this point. So he's very anxious, but he's also very calm at the same time in the face of facing his possible punishment, right? So, really enjoying Crime and Punishment so far. I honestly want to read more of Fyodor Dostoevsky's books right after this one, so we'll see. But this one is definitely hard hitting. But I think this is also pretty accessible so far. I'm reading the Oliver Ready translation, very accessible. A lot of footnotes to help you understand the historical context. So I definitely am not intimidated reading more of this. I'm listening to the audiobook of Flesh by David Zale. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But this is part of the Booker list of finalists, and I'm about an hour in to the audiobook, and it's a 9-hour audiobook. I was immediately hooked into this book, and I really, really am enjoying it so far, actually. Despite the fact that it's also quite heavy as well, unfortunately, but maybe that's why I'm drawn to it. I don't know. I so this book is about a young boy named Ishvan. We follow him through starting from his being a teenager, and basically it's kind of like a slice of life book. It's following him as a young teenager. He is being sexually abused by an older neighbor, and the that's kind of the part where I'm at right now, and it kind of follows him from that point. It's dealing a lot with the issues of masculinity and loneliness and trauma. I don't really have much to say on it so far, but I'll talk a little bit about it in the spoiler section. So I honestly really like David's writing style. It brings you really up close and personal. And he does hold a lot of juxtaposition in his writing as well. So, like for example, in the parts that I read so far, right, the main character Ishvan and his neighbor, which who he calls the lady, she doesn't ever really have a name. I thought it was just very interesting how he feels that there is nothing necessarily wrong with this relationship. He's a teenager, I'm pretty sure, or very, 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 or very young teenager. And he's being coerced into sex by his 42-year-old neighbor. I thought it was very interesting what his thoughts are, right? So his thought about being in a relationship, if anyone found out about this relationship, is that he would be ashamed because he would be ashamed because he doesn't want anyone to know that he's in a relationship with an older woman because that would be shameful. And eventually, he says that he loves this woman, which is very interesting, right? And again, no part of this in this saga does he feel like anything is wrong with this relationship. He just knows that he feels this connection because he's been so lonely, right? And there is a connection there, right? However warped and twisted it is. So very interesting dynamic, which I really enjoyed. I'm also 22% into Leviathan Wakes by S.A. Corey, and about 20% of the way into Fablehaven. I read very, very little of these, but I just wanted to let you know that I am in the middle of reading them, and I'm excited to continue both of them. Those are the 4 books that I'm currently reading right now, and I will check back in with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, today it is March 25th and I'm actually currently at work, but I did have some time yesterday to read a few things, so I wanted to talk about it today. I haven't had any chance to read today though, so I'll probably update you on that tomorrow. But the first book that I'm currently in the middle of, I have my books here, my e-reader, and I'm currently on my Libby app. I'm currently about 28% into Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. I'm gonna be honest with you, I wasn't sure about this book at first, but now that I'm further into it, I am hook, line, and sinker, which is very, very exciting to me. So I don't think I explained what this book was about on Monday, but essentially it is a space opera science fiction series. This first book, and so far that I've read, it follows 2 main characters. One is Holden. The ship that he was on has been destroyed by who we don't know, and only Holden and some like 2 or 3 of his other crew members are alive on this separate ship, and someone is going to come and pick them up, and they alternate between chapters. So the other chapter point of view is, his name is Miller and he's a detective. He's what considered a belter. So basically he lives in the asteroid belt. So his people are called belters. And he is trying to solve a missing persons case of a daughter of a very wealthy family and corporation. So I'm sure they're going to meet at some point, but they haven't from where I'm reading. I think the world building is really interesting because it's set in the future where basically we have colonized the solar system. So the 2 superpowers are Earth and Mars, but they have control over this asteroid belt area. But there's other alliances, other allegiances that are trying to vie for power. So I kind of describe this as, I don't know if anyone has watched the show Reacher, but it's basically Reacher but in space. And it's not Reacher in the sense that, there's a superhuman guy punching people, but the plot lines are very similar, and the amount of character work versus world building versus plot is very, very similar to Reacher. So you kind of have like character archetypes, and they kind of speak in like one-liners. Like they never complete a sentence; they just talk in phrases almost. There's a lot of plot happening, but the characters are fleshed out like just enough for you to kind of care about them, right? This is not a book about existentialism or anything too deep. It's purely like very action based, and normally I don't really like that as much, especially if it's not done well. But I do think that James S.A. Corey has a good knack for developing the characters just enough and providing really interesting world building enough for me to go on. And I do think that since this is the first book in a series, things will continue to build on and on and on. And I do like that there is a bigger conspiracy, bigger plot line happening in the book. So I'm honestly really excited. I hope the pacing continues on. But again, I'm only 28% of the way through, so not that much. So there is another book that I'm still currently reading via audiobook. It's called Flesh by David Zalay. This is a literary fiction novel. It is very interesting. It's interesting because I'm currently reading The Stranger by Albert Camus too. It has this very existential bent to it. The main character is very detached from everything. So the writing is extremely detached, very sort of distant, but at the same time, I feel like you definitely really understand what's going on with this character. And it's kind of an exploration of trauma and loneliness and masculinity. I do really feel like his mindset, the character's mindset, is written very well, because the author doesn't spoon feed you what's happening. In fact, often he will skip chunks of events that normally books would kind of go over, and then kind of fast forwards it to the second to how the main character is feeling in the first place about it. And he is a very reserved character. If he was a person in real life, I would probably he would be someone that has alexithymia, so someone who doesn't quite even know how he's feeling, or has kind of like a flattened sense of emotion. And so a lot of times you see that he doesn't understand how he's feeling about a situation, and other people will kind of laugh at him, kind of think he's a bit odd for not reacting the same way as other people. And I'll talk a little bit about it in this spoiler section now. So basically, when he talks about his friend who died in the Iraq War, right? We don't get kind of this long, drawn out process of like PTSD symptoms and like nightmares and flashbacks and hyperventilation and agitation and all of that. It's very, very subtle. So we kind of flash forward to when he sees a therapist, and the only really kind of inkling we understand that he's going through something is that his mom is referring him to a therapist. He admits to his therapist that he's been thinking a lot about his friend, and he uses substances. So there's like bits and pieces where you can kind of piece his mental state together, but it's not like really spelled out for you, right? And I think it's just a very human way of approaching it. I don't even know what I mean by that, but I think it's such a subtle way of approaching it that is so real, even though it's so detached. So I think it's just very interesting, and I think the writing is very well done in that aspect as well. So I'm 34% into the audiobook for Flesh. I do like the narrator as well, so I'll definitely be continuing on with that. What I will not be continuing on with is actually a historical romance book that I just started, which is The Raquel of Roth by Molly Howard. This is the sequel to The Beast of Beswick, which I also read this month, and I'll talk about it more in my March wrap up. But I absolutely adore The Beast of Beswick. It's probably one of my favorite historical romances of all time. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it's so sweet but so passionate at the same time. And this is the story. The sequel follows the main character from the first book, her sister. And I'm gonna be honest with you, her sister is not quite as compelling. In the first book, she's presented as like a girl's girl. She really likes to do girly things, feminine things, knitting, taking care of the home, wanting kids, right? Which is all fine, but I wish they had just stuck with that personality of hers just as it is. Because now in this book, the author, I think, tries to make her more likable by making her more sassy and more stubborn and more out there and more really experienced and all of that. And I feel like while both of these are fine, I think it was better for, we knew Isabel from the last book as someone who's more demure, right? More quiet and more reserved. Um, and I wish I had stuck with that. I really wish I had stuck with that because now she's starting to feel a like a B-rated copy of her sister, right? I think it would be much more fascinating to kind of explore her as she is, right? And in the beginning of the book, there's already like right off the bat like a sexual attraction there, which it got kind of old. So because there was no tension there, and basically after her from the events of the first book, after she and her husband kind of get married for with like a marriage of convenience type situation, but he doesn't really want to get married, so he kind of leaves the house for like 3 years until she decides enough is enough and goes to follow him to London and get him to come back to the estate where she lives. So I just didn't find any of it very interesting at all, and I don't think Howard developed these. I think she kind of just did a 180 for the main character, which I didn't really like, and I didn't really care for like the hero's reasons for not wanting to be with her. Right, just was not as compelling as the Duke's in the first book, and maybe I'm being unfair by comparing it, but I I don't think it's enough to drive the plot of an entire story. So I gotta look for another historical romance novel because I am craving something after reading The Beast of Beswick. So those are my Tuesday updates, and I haven't read anything really yet today, except I did listen to some of Flesh. But yeah, I will keep you updated.
Today is Sunday, March 29th, and I'm here to just kind of wrap up the whole week's worth of reading. So I finished up two books in the past few days, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. But the two books that I read, the first one is a novella called On Earth as It Is Beneath by Ana Paula Maria. This was translated from the Portuguese, and I think this one is also on the long list for the Booker, I think. I'm not sure, but something like that is about a remote penal colony that hosts, I think, about 40 prisoners. And this is kind of like the last place that prisoners are transferred to. All the prisoners know that when they go to this colony, they will end up staying there for life or dying. And they sort of learn during their time there that they're going to be transferred over to another place, but they don't know if that person is going to come and tell them the official news before they die, right? And the reason why they're so afraid of dying is because every single night, the warden of this colony actually he takes two prisoners and he kind of lets them go free into the woods. And if he can catch them and kill them with his gun, then he will, then they just die. But there is like a slim chance of freedom. And the cycle kind of continues on every single night. And so at this point in the book, there's only a handful of prisoners left. So a pretty eerie premise there. I think that this book was pretty sparse in its writing, but pretty heavy on the imagery. This remote colony is built on land that used to be used to torture and punish slaves. So as they're digging the ground and burying these prisoners that they've killed. They find the bones of the enslaved in the ground, and you can kind of see how she's kind of building up on that imagery of violence, right? What once was used for violence is now continuing that cycle of violence as well. We do follow a couple of prisoners and the warden's perspective and kind of jumping back and forth between them. I think that she does such a good job of piecing such limited information together, but telling you so much about each character. And the recurring theme that really stood out to me was the themes of indifference. And these the warden and his assistant, right? They grew up with, and many of these prisoners too, they grew up with violence. Violence was all they knew, and some of them even did killings for other people. It begs the question, what is justice and what is that morality, right? People want to look away from what is happening at the colony, right? Everyone knows about the colony, everyone knows what's happening in the colony, but there's nothing done about it, right? There's no second chance for these prisoners. There is no redemption for them. Um, and most of them just kind of grew up in this environment and kind of grew up just knowing and understanding violence, right? And because they are so familiar with it, they become indifferent to it. And then it starts to become this insidious cycle because one of the warden's assistants, he kind of carries out a lot of these punishments and killings. And he, it says in the book that he has no morals, he has no principles, he has no ideology or creed. He just kind of does what he is told to do. And when you don't have any of those views, and if you were brought up in this environment, right, you don't really see anyone else as human anymore. And they say that you can't really see anyone as human because otherwise it would kind of ruin your soul. Right? So there's a lot of questions about justice, about morality, about, and I think that all of those concepts were done just well in a very, very short amount of time. No words were wasted. And even with such limited information, you really get to understand so much of the system, so much of these people, and it's really well written. So I would highly recommend this one. It's also a short one. I think one of the characters actually appears in a previous book that she wrote, so which was also a pretty short novella. So I'm also going to be reading that as well, and I'll keep you updated on my thoughts on that. And then I finished an audiobook yesterday as well. I finished Flesh by David Zalea. I like this book, I think. I don't think this will be my all time favorite book next, but I really, really, really did enjoy this book. And it really made me think, and I think it was really creative in the way that it set up the book and how the author wrote the book as well. I think the most unique thing about this book was definitely, definitely, definitely the writing. I think honestly, the writing was outstanding. Although I will admit that it is not for everyone. So the way that it is written, it kind of reminds me of, if anyone's ever read the book The Stranger by Albert Camus, kind of combined with Stoner by John Williams, which was my favorite book of last year. It's written in a very detached, very sparse, and minimal way. And in fact, the dialogue contains the word okay maybe like 500 times. Now, there is a certain realism in the book, but I can understand if people become really frustrated with the dialogue and the detached and passive nature of the main character, right? Because most of the action that he takes is off the page, it's not on the page, right? And I do think that it's both a strength and a weakness, right? On the one hand, it does make for a really quick read. On the other hand, if you wanted to know more about his history, more about his thoughts, more about his feelings, you're not going to really get that. But in a way, I really enjoyed that. He also makes very deliberate and intentional choices about the story narrative. A lot of times writers will keep a lot of events on the page, which I thought was very interesting, and I thought it was employed very well because you actually don't really get to know the main character through himself. You actually get to know him more through other characters and through other interactions with other people, which I thought was so fascinating. And again, he doesn't spoon feed you any of the what he is thinking. It's all about that. Again, it's all about how others perceive him is how the reader gets information about our main character. So that can be very pretty frustrating for people, I think, but to me, I thought it was such a unique way of approaching the story, and so I really liked that as well. And it also talks a lot in themes about masculinity and loneliness. I thought this was such a real depiction of how a man reacts to events. And I'll kind of give an example of I'll give an example of what I mean. A very, very mild spoiler, so if you don't want that, just skip ahead. So there is a part in the book where he goes to a therapist and he talks about what happened to him. He never really talks about his feelings. Like those things are try people try to pull those emotions and feelings out of him, but he never really talks about it himself. So the therapist will ask, like, how do you feel about a certain situation? How do you feel about this? And he will say, I don't know, never really thought about that, which I thought was so accurate and so realistic. It really actually gave me a lot more patience for men, I guess, is how I want to put it. It really does give you kind of insight into their minds and why it's so difficult to speak about these experiences and feelings, right? Because realistically, in the book, he was never taught to talk about them. He was never taught how to be in tune with those emotions, right? Because he was always taught to ignore them, to move on, to maybe fight back. Everything is happening through action, right? So he never really has the space to understand how to express those emotions. And that kind of interiority work and character work, I think, was so, so, so well done. And honestly, even though I felt detached from him, at some points, I actually just wanted to cry for him because it was just so devastating how sometimes he would want to say, I think he would want to say certain things, but he would struggle to communicate them. And there's a lot of sadness in the things that are unsaid in this book. And this I think this I think this book is unlike a lot of other books out there and really really explores that the internal character. So I thought that was really well done. Again, I think just because of that writing style, I am a little detached from it, but I found myself thinking about this book quite a lot. So that should tell you something there. And I also thought he had a fascinating approach to trauma and big events that affect us because it doesn't follow kind of like that a linear path, right? If something bad happens to us, it will come up in ways continuing through our life, right? But in ways that are obvious and some ways that are not, right? And there, I think I did talk about this in the last clip, but at the beginning of the book, he was sexually coerced into a relationship with a 42-year-old woman. And while he honestly never talks about this event for the rest of the book, you can see very clearly how it affects each part of his life and the relationships that he pursues. So I also thought that was really well done because I feel like in this day and age, trauma is written quite expressively, quite detailed, graphically. I think it is written like a B and C linear timeline, which it does not happen, right? Some people never talk about it. Some people, it manifests in different ways, the things that really affect us. And I thought that was just so realistic as well. So it's quite a quiet book in that way as well. So I really enjoyed that as well. So all in all, I'm really, really happy that I read this book. I will still be thinking about it. I gave it a 4 stars. I also rated On Earth as It Is Beneath also 4 stars. So it's been a really strong reading week. So I think to summarize, I read the parts I needed to for Crime and Punishment. I finished On Earth as It Is Beneath. I finished Flush, which is my audiobook of the week, and I am still making progress through Leviathan Wakes by S.A. Corey, and I DNF'd The Raquel of Roth. All in all, a very diverse reading week, and hopefully I will continue that into the next week. But my next video is probably going to be my March wrap up, where I talk a lot more in depth about all of these books that I read. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.